Picture a Roman battlefield. The ground shakes with marching legionaries, shields locked and javelins raised, but something's missing. No ranks of archers firing arrows into the sky. Why would the most powerful army in the ancient world avoid one of the oldest and most prevalent weapons in warfare? Did the Romans really not use archers? In truth, the reality is more complex. From the earliest days of the Roman kingdom, through the centuries of the Republic and into the vast empire, the role of the bow in Roman warfare shifted. Sometimes limited, sometimes decisive, and by the late empire, far more prominent than before. In this video, we'll trace that development, who Rome's archers were, the weapons they used, how they were deployed, and why the bow gradually moved from the margins to a significant place in Roman military practice. The earliest phases of Roman history, the semi-legendary kingdom period and the early republic, provide scant direct evidence of archers in Roman armies. However, we know that the neighboring Etruscans, who heavily influenced early Roman culture, were skilled archers and used the bow in hunting and warfare. The Romans likely absorbed some Etruscan military practices, including archery, in their formative years. For example, the bow was associated with deities like Apollo and Diana, suggesting archery was not unknown in early Roman society. Despite this influence, archery did not become a prominent part of early Roman battle tactics. The warfare of the early and mid-Republic, roughly between the 5th and 3rd centuries BC, centered on heavy infantry and close combat. Rome's citizen soldiers were organized first as spearmen in the Greek hoplite style, likely inspired by the Greek colonies of southern Italy, and later in the famous legionary formation with the gladius sword and throwing javelin pilum. Light skirmishers, called velites, carried javelins and sometimes slings, but notably not bows. In this period, relatively few Italians were proficient with the bow, so Rome could not draw on substantial native archer levies. Instead, when range support was needed, the Romans relied on allied communities famous for skirmishing. The Balearic Islands provided slingers, and other Italians provided javelin men. Archers, if present, appear to have been rare and usually auxiliaries, allies, or people from conquered territory. Auxiliaries served the Romans for pay and the promise of citizenship when their work was completed. Cultural attitudes may have played a role in this early de-emphasis on archery. Like the Greeks, early Romans tended to glorify hand-to-hand combat. Launching missiles from afar was sometimes seen as less honorable than facing an enemy with sword or spear. The Roman military historian Vegetius, writing in the 4th century AD, remarked that legionaries throwing their pilum javelins before a charge, quote, seemed to supply the place of archers, softening the enemy at close range. This implies Romans felt their approach made dedicated bowmen less necessary. Vegetius also criticized the effectiveness of lightly armored foot archers. He asked rhetorically, what can be expected from a foot archer without cuirass or helmet, who cannot hold at once his bow and shield? In short, the early Roman military system and ethos left little room for archers, beyond occasional foreign auxiliaries. As the Republic expanded in the middle to late centuries BC, Romans increasingly encountered enemies who made effective use of archery. In response, Roman armies began incorporating more allied and mercenary archers. During the 2nd century BC, in wars against Hellenistic Greek kingdoms, Roman generals hired specialist bowmen from Crete in particular, and other regions famed for archery. The Cretans were renowned mercenary archers. Armies like Rome's, which lacked abundant native archers, extensively utilized Cretan bowmen. By the time of Gaius Marius's military reforms around 107 BC, Cretan archers were regularly serving alongside Roman legions. Marius's reform abolished the old citizen light troop velites, meaning Rome had to outsource light missile support to non-legionary troops. Mercenary archers from Crete, Numidia, and other regions filled this gap in late Republican armies. One example comes from Julius Caesar's campaigns in the middle of the 1st century BC. Caesar made use of allied archers, particularly Cretans, to augment his primarily infantry forces. He generally employed these archers in a supporting and defensive role. for instance, to screen the flanks of his legions or protect against enemy cavalry charges. Meanwhile, during Caesar's civil war against Pompey, the Pompeian side amassed a large contingent of archers. At the decisive Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BC, Pompey deployed thousands of bowmen, largely recruited from the eastern Mediterranean. These archers showered Caesar's troops with arrows, illustrating that by the late Republic, archers could play a significant battlefield role, even if in this case, Caesar still won. Still, it must be emphasized that Roman archery units in the Republic were ad hoc and foreign. There were no legionary archer companies composed of Roman citizens. Archers were almost always auxiliaries or mercenaries under Roman pay. In 53 BC, Marcus Crassus famously invaded Parthia and met disaster at Carrhae, largely due to swarms of Parthian horse archers. The Romans' lack of archers and cavalry in that battle led to one of the most deadly Roman defeats. This wake-up call highlighted Rome's vulnerability to arrow fire. In the aftermath of Carrhae, Roman leaders realized they needed to adapt. From that point forward, the Roman military began incorporating more archers into its ranks. By the end of the Republic, archers had become a fixture of Roman armies, though still mainly as auxiliary units recruited from archery-practiced cultures. With the establishment of the imperial system under Augustus in 27 BC came a more formal organization of auxiliary forces. The auxilia became the standing non-citizen corps supporting the legions, and among these were numerous dedicated archer units called Sagittarii. During the early empire of the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, Roman armies across the provinces had specialist archer regiments of foot and horse. In fact, roughly 2/3 of imperial archers were infantry, and 1/3 were mounted, reflecting the continued importance of both types. Many of these units were originally raised from the eastern provinces where archery traditions were strong. Crete continued to supply some archers, but as the empire grew, Syria, Anatolia, Thrace, and other eastern regions became the primary recruiting grounds for archers. By the middle of the 2nd century, one survey found 32 auxiliary units titled Sagittarii in the Roman army, of which only one was Cretan, while the vast majority was Syrian or from neighboring eastern peoples. This underscores how the typical Roman archer of the imperial era was often a Syrian, Palestinian, or other East Mediterranean specialist serving Rome. Roman legionaries, who were citizens, generally remained heavy infantrymen with swords and pila, not bows. The standard weapon of Roman archers in the imperial era was the composite recurved bow. This bow, made of layered wood, horn, and sinew, was compact yet powerful. Composite bows had originated from the steppe nomads in the east, and the Romans adopted them enthusiastically for their archers. Archaeology confirms that Roman composite bows were manufactured and used even in far-flung provinces like Britannia. Despite Britain's damp climate being less ideal for horn and sinew bows, Romans found ways to maintain them, such as using protective cases to keep them dry. Bone laths from composite bows have been found at many Roman military sites across Europe and the Near East, attesting to their wide use. Roman archers typically wore light to medium armor. Surviving reliefs, such as Trajan's column in Rome, depict Roman archers in a mix of gear. Some wear scale armor, and helmets are usually conical or pointed, of the Eastern style. Scholars identify the archers shown on Trajan's column, which commemorates the Dacian Wars, as Syrians or other Levantines in Roman service. They are depicted with composite bows and even long-sleeved tunics or trousers, marking them as distinct from the Italian legionaries on the same monument. Roman military writers paid attention to arrow design as well. Different arrowheads were used for different targets. Broad-headed arrows with wide blades caused grievous wounds to unarmored foes. For example, against tribal warriors wearing no armor. On the other hand, narrow bodkin-style arrowheads were issued to penetrate armor when fighting enemies with helmets and mail or scale armor, such as Parthian or Sassanid heavy troops. This tactical flexibility in ammunition shows the Romans understood the technical aspects of archery well. In battle, imperial Roman archers were used as supporting troops to the legions. A key doctrine was to soften or disorganize the enemy with missile fire before the decisive infantry charge. Commanders often positioned foot archers just behind or interspersed among the frontline infantry, where they could shoot over the heads of the legionaries. For example, one common tactic was to station archers a short distance behind the heavy infantry line. From there, they would launch arrows that rained down on the advancing enemy, breaking up their formations and morale. By the time the enemy closed in, they were ideally already thinned out and wavering from the arrow storm. Under Emperor Vespasian of the late 1st century, who had extensive experience in the Jewish revolt, archers were used proactively. In the siege of Jerusalem of 70 AD, archers secured city streets and pinned down defenders with covering fire while legionaries advanced. Accounts describe Roman archers holding the ends of streets and pouring arrows into masses of rebels, an unusually aggressive use of archers in close-quarters urban fighting. These examples show that by the early empire, Roman archers could be tactically decisive in certain scenarios. In siege warfare, archers were invaluable to both attackers and defenders. Roman siegecraft relied on artillery like ballistas for long-range bombardment, but archers provided more portable fire. When besieging a fort or city, Romans would bring up archers to suppress enemy ramparts. Their arrows could clear defenders off the walls or make them keep their heads down while Roman engineers moved siege towers and battering rams into place. Despite their presence and utility, Roman archers in the early empire still had a somewhat secondary status. They were mostly drawn from the auxiliaries and were less highly trained and less respected than the legionaries. By the late empire, roughly from the 3rd to the 6th centuries AD, the Roman military underwent significant changes, and archery gained a more central role. Several factors drove this evolution. First, Rome faced new enemies, particularly on the eastern and northern frontiers, who fought with powerful mounted archers. The Parthian and later Sasanian Persian empires fielded heavy cavalry and horse archers that could outshoot and outmaneuver slow Roman infantry. Even more dramatically, the invasions of the Huns and other steppe nomads in the 4th and 5th centuries brought forces that were overwhelmingly archery-focused. These mounted archers could strike fast and disappear, and their composite bows offered formidable range and power. In response, the Romans adapted their own tactics and organization. Emperors of the late 3rd and 4th century, such as Gallienus, Diocletian, and Constantine, created more mobile field armies with a higher proportion of cavalry, where horse archers were integrated into the Roman army in greater numbers. By the late 4th century, entire units of mounted archers are listed in the Roman order of battle, especially in the Eastern Empire. Many of these Roman horse archers were probably of Central Asian or Germanic origin. The empire began to recruit Huns, Alans, and Goths into its cavalry. But they fought under Roman organization, and by the 5th century, the bow and arrow had become a primary weapon for a significant portion of Roman troops. According to the Notitia Dignitatum, a document of the late Roman Empire that details the administrative organization of the Western and the Eastern Roman Empire, dozens of units with the title Sagittarii existed, and they were disproportionately deployed in the East and in North Africa. This distribution reflects the strategic reality. The Eastern Empire, facing Persia and various nomadic peoples, needed large numbers of archers to counter the enemy's style of warfare. Technologically, the late Roman composite bow became more advanced, influenced by designs from the Huns and Persians. The Romans adopted the Hunnic-style asymmetric composite bow, which had longer upper limbs, optimizing it for use on horseback. Improved saddle technology, the four-horn saddle, improved stability for Roman cavalry, which might have aided their ability to shoot while charging. By the 5th century, archery, especially mounted archery, had become a central part of Roman field armies, far more important than in earlier centuries. Procopius, a Byzantine historian of the 6th century, notes that cavalry with bows were the main arm of Roman field forces by his time. The shift from the old legionary model of heavy infantry with some support archers to a more cavalry and archery-focused army was essentially complete. After the Western Empire fell in 476 AD, the Eastern Roman Empire, also called Byzantine Empire, continued to utilize mass archery and horse archers for centuries, perfecting tactics that the old Republican Romans would have scarcely recognized. Given this history, why does the question, why didn't the Romans use archers, arise at all? It's clear Romans did use archers, but the extent and emphasis changed over time. The idea comes from the fact that, for much of Rome's earlier history, archers were only a marginal part of Roman armies. Republican Rome prized hand-to-hand combat, lacked a strong native archery tradition, and usually faced enemies who could be defeated without massed bowmen. As a result, archers often appeared only as foreign auxiliaries, making them seem less Roman than the legionary with sword and shield. But when conditions required, Rome absolutely did use archers, and even came to rely on them. From mercenary Cretans in Republican times to the numerous foot and horse archers of the late Empire, the bow and arrow gradually earned its place in the Roman arsenal. In a way, the story comes full circle. The early Romans might have looked down on archers, but the later Romans became archers. The true lesson isn't that the Romans failed to use archers, but rather that they used archers when and where it made sense. For much of their history, heavy infantry was enough to triumph. When that was no longer the case, the Romans effectively adapted to the changing military landscape. Roman armies that once marched without a single bowman eventually fielded some of antiquity's most formidable archer units. In the end, Rome's famed adaptability extended even to the weapon it once neglected, the humble bow and arrow. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications so you won't miss our upcoming documentaries on military tactics, weaponry, and daily life in ancient times.